There are so many parallels between digital communication and how people communicate. I found it appropriate to create what I call an engineer's guide to communication. What's up, guys? It's Markel, and today I want to talk about communication, and specifically digital communication and human communication and how they're kind of parallel to one another. The first thing I want to start with is medium richness theory. Medium richness theory is essentially this fact, this concept that says that the richer the medium, the more effective it is in communicating. So you have lower mediums, which would include things like sending a letter via pigeon. And then you would have higher versions of communication, which are phone calls or FaceTime. But the highest form of communication, as far as humans are concerned, is face-to-face. And that's because it is the richest form of communication, meaning it has the most information that's available to process and to be able to kind of analyze in order to understand a message. By understanding media richness theory, I think that it will help in being able to be better communicators. So for example, if you send an email to someone and you say, "Why did you do this?" The challenge is there's no tone, there's no back information or background information, and you're not quite sure what they mean, what's kind of hidden within that message. And so now you don't know how to respond to that message, right, in the email form. But if I say something like that to you in person, you have all of these cues, the nonverbal cues, the tone of my voice, maybe how I look at you, in order to understand what I'm actually trying to say. What I find interesting about all of this is how medium richness theory kind of parallels digital communication. Let's step aside for a moment and not look at human communication and explore a little bit about digital communication. Digital communication is essentially the communication that is between different electronic devices, right? So you have things like your cell phone, you have things like your computer, you have things like networks inside of your car, and that's exactly what I want to talk about here as far as a digital communication. Specifically, CAN, Controller Area Network. And so CAN was invented and developed in like the 1980s by like a German supplier, and eventually it kind of found its way into the Mercedes-Benz, I believe in 1991, and that was kind of debuted there, and eventually it was adopted by all automakers until this day. Like, that's still what automakers use. And essentially the beauty behind CAN is that it allows multiple devices to be on the same network and essentially speak most nearly simultaneously. It's still in order by priority, but it's basically saying we have all of these devices that can speak and listen most nearly simultaneously. Again, it's not exactly simultaneously, but they basically just take turns to speak on a network to effectively communicate. So I've been working with CAN for a few years now at work, and I think it's like super fascinating as a digital communication protocol, but I didn't always feel that way. In fact, I remember it was a senior engineer who was teaching me how CAN worked, and I kind of like dozed off during that like tutorial or that instructional session. And so my bad. I like it now, so hopefully he's watching this. And so yeah, like CAN is pretty dope. Now I definitely appreciate what CAN is and how imperative it is within a vehicle. There's a few things I want to kind of touch up on within this digital communication protocol and then relay that back into human communication. So the first thing that I find really interesting about CAN is that, and all digital protocols effectively do this, and that is the synchronization of communicating. So everything has to be on some type of schedule, everything has to be timed. So this is not exclusive to CAN, but every communication protocol has to essentially be matched within its time. And with that synchronization, I think it's basically saying that in human communication, it means being on the same page, being on the same wavelength, right? So it's being able to set that same cadence within the communication. So I think that's the first important thing. The second thing that I think is super cool about CAN is what they call arbitration. And essentially arbitration is this thing that handles disputes. So say two different controllers within this network are trying to communicate at the same time. Essentially, they would both have some type of identifier that says, hey, I am this message and I am this message, right? And based on their identifier, there's a priority set that says that there's a deference of who gets to actually send the message. So essentially it says that the device or the message that's trying to transmit with the lowest number wins, and everything else kind of shuts up until it tries again in a few tens or hundreds of milliseconds. And so what that kind of could mean in like human communication is taking turns and kind of understanding the priority of someone trying to speak relative to yourself. And I feel like we often don't do that when we talk. We all are just kind of trying to speak at the same time, but then no one's listening. But the thing is, the bus is such that only one person can really speak, but then anyone can listen. The next thing that's really cool about CAN is what is called the acknowledgement bit. And now that I realize it, I should have put up what an actual CAN frame or message would look like. So I'll display that right here or right over here. So you can see essentially what a message looks like. So you have the arbitration or the message identifier. And then on the other end of the message, you have what's called like an acknowledgement bit. And the acknowledgement bit is basically something that the receiver, some receiver just says like, yep, got it. And that is essentially in human communication, the nod or to acknowledge that, hey, I am able to receive the messages that you're transmitting. So is exactly what it sounds like, an acknowledgement that the message was received. I will say, I feel like this is one of the things that we do a decent job at as far as human communication. We do acknowledge things, but we don't necessarily fully understand them. And so that's what the next thing really kind of tackles. And that is called a CRC, or cyclic redundancy check. So a cyclic redundancy check is essentially some math done on the signal that was transmitted. And it says, hey, I sent this information, but also what I'm going to do is append a little bit more information at the end of this message that's essentially some math done on it. So then you can compute and make sure that you got the gist of what I was saying, or not even the gist, you got exactly what I was trying to say. And so the reason they do this in digital communication is that if you flip a bit or you flip a little bit of the information, you can make sure that it's properly been received and it didn't get corrupted at all. And if it did, you'd be able to check against this cyclic redundancy check, or CRC. And I feel like within human communication, what that would probably look like is summarizing what you say in different words. If you just say what you just said with the same wording, then that person can still misconstrue. But I feel like if you can summarize or consolidate that statement by changing the wording, you are maybe more likely able to be effective when trying to communicate a message to somebody. And then I would be remiss if I forgot what is the meat of it, and that is the data frame. And so it's surrounded by the message ID, it's surrounded by the redundancy check, the acknowledgement bits, but in the middle of it is the information you actually want, the data. This is really interesting because the way that it works is there's essentially like this database that you reference and you say, hey, you will get a message in these locations and they will be able to then be processed and mean this. So if I say 1, that means up. If I say 2, that means down. And so I won't be able to send you up or down, but I'll send you 1 or 2, and then you'll know what 1 or 2 means. That's essentially how the data bits would work, right? You would have some information being transmitted, and then you would know what that information means. And what I find interesting is that I don't think that there's like a good equivalent in like human communication. I think this is where a lot of fallout happens within communication. We transmit these things and we say like 1 or we say 2, but we don't tell someone what our 1 or 2 means. For example, if I say, imagine a dog, what does that dog look like to you? So to me, that dog could be short, but if I say a short dog, what kind of dog is that? And so now I'm not giving you enough resolution to essentially draw the same image that I have in my mind. And so that's why we have labels that we can essentially assign to things to make it a little bit more specific. So if I say, imagine a white terrier. So now you've been able to whittle down, and we both know maybe what a terrier looks like, but there are different variants of terriers. So there's again that nuance. So the challenge in communication, I feel, is in that data pocket where a lot of things can be misconstrued, but it's how do you make sure that it's mapped to someone accordingly in a language or in a way that they can then process. So when thinking about digital communication, I feel like there are a few things that we as humans can consider when trying to be effective in human communication. In order to be a good communicator, I think it's first being able to provide a quality of information that is understood by the receiver, not necessarily understood by the transmitter. Of course, it's understood by the transmitter, but you have to get it to the receiver. And so how do you transmit that message that the receiver can understand and reproduce? Because they may be able to understand it, but to be able to reproduce it is kind of that next level up. Because when you can reproduce it, then you can do a lot more with that information. So I think that's the first big takeaway that I kind of think about with digital to human communication. I think the second thing is laying down the groundwork for communicating. And so the fact that CAN was developed over years and years of efforts by a ton of brilliant engineers and is still used to this day says that this is a dope and very comprehensive framework of communication. Like, it's emulated, it's copied, it's utilized pretty much everywhere in automotive. And it's for a reason. Oftentimes when we speak to another person, we don't necessarily set the ground rules, set the foundation for how we want to communicate with them. It's kind of this, I'm just going to talk, then you can talk, then I'm going to cut you off, then we'll kind of just go from there. But I find that some of my best relationships are when we establish some kind of ground level understanding of how we want to communicate and being able to be transparent and also finding ways to be effective to that other person. I feel like we don't often do that with other people. We just kind of, well, this isn't worth it, so I'm just going to throw out this information and hopefully they're on the same page. Hopefully they have the same structure of messages and hopefully they can process this information the way that I intend them to process this information, which we know isn't true or always going to be the case. And with this understanding of this communication protocol, I started to notice a lot of parallels or a lot of kind of disjointed areas within communication between people within the workplace. People talking at the same time, people not understanding what the other person meant, people have different frames of reference as far as their understanding, but I rarely saw people trying to understand what their source or their database of understanding was to then be able to map their messages accordingly. It was often just, let me just say the same thing to you until you understand. And if you don't understand, why don't you understand? And that's really interesting. And that's kind of where I come in. I like to go in and look at how people communicate and find what they're really trying to say and get to the meat of their message, decode that, reconstruct it in a way that is now parsable or understood by someone else. And so that they can be receptive, they can be open to it, and then create alignment that way. Yeah, my question to you would be, do you consider yourself a effective, not good, because I don't think that's a quality word here, but effective communicator, both as a transmitter and as a receiver? Are you able to understand people well? Are you able to navigate appropriately and be able to get things done that need to get done? And if you are, let me know in the comments what you think makes you an effective communicator. And if you're not an effective communicator, let me know why. Maybe you think it's like a personality thing, or maybe you have a challenge where people may misunderstand you for some reason. But yeah, I'm curious what you have experienced and how you kind of navigate this communication, especially or specifically because we can't be always or really ever at the highest or the richest form of communication, which is face-to-face. So now we're faced with this challenge of, how do I effectively communicate via email, via Slack, via Zoom, and not really see people in person to be able to say the more nuanced things that I didn't really know I wanted to transmit, but would help them understand my message. I guess another question is, how are you dealing with not seeing people face-to-face? And how has that impacted your communication? Because Zoom is dope, FaceTime is dope, but nothing beats face-to-face. So if you found this cool, found this interesting, found this insightful, give this a thumbs up, and more videos are gonna drop like this because I'm an engineer and I like engineering stuff. So feel free to subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.